Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a place so brutal, so relentlessly punishing, and so drenched in human suffering that even other enslaved people across the Americas heard whispers about it and prayed they'd never be sent there. We're talking about the 18th century Caribbean sugar plantation, a place where the average life expectancy of a newly arrived African was measured not in decades, not even in years, but sometimes in months. A place where the product was so sweet that an entire continent developed an insatiable craving for it, and so bitter in its making that it consumed human beings the way a furnace consumes wood. This is something that demands both your attention and your respect, because the story of sugar isn't just the story of a crop. It's the story of how the modern world was built on the backs of people who were never meant to survive the building. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from tonight. Tell me where you're listening and whether you've ever put sugar in your coffee without once thinking about where it came from, who harvested it, or what it cost in human life. Because after tonight, you will. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Get yourself settled, maybe pull a blanket up, because where we're going tonight, the heat is going to do most of the work for you. And trust me, you'll want to appreciate the comfort of your bed, because the people we're about to walk alongside didn't have one. Let's get curious for a second. What did it actually feel like to wake up on a sugar plantation in the 1700s? Not a cotton plantation in Virginia or a tobacco field in Maryland, but a Caribbean sugar estate, the kind historians call the deadliest workplace in the Western Hemisphere. What happened when the conch shell blew before the sun came up? What did the air taste like in the boiling house at 2 in the morning? How did it feel to feed stalks of cane into rollers that could crush your arm to pulp if you lost focus for half a second? Did you know that sugar plantations kept an axe next to the mill, not for cutting wood, but for cutting off the limbs of workers who got pulled into the machinery? That there were plantations in Jamaica where an enslaved person's working life was estimated at 7 years before they simply died from the labor. That the death rate was so catastrophic, so constant, that the enslaved population couldn't sustain itself through birth alone and had to be replenished by a continuous stream of kidnapped Africans arriving on ships. What does it mean that your morning cup of tea was sweetened by that? Congratulations. You've just woken up in the year 1754 on a sugar plantation somewhere on the island of Jamaica. The air is already warm and thick, the kind of wet heat that sits on your chest like a hand pressing down. You haven't opened your eyes yet, but your body already knows what's coming. Your back is stiff from lying on packed earth covered with a thin layer of dried grass. Your shoulders ache from yesterday. Your hands are swollen. The skin across your palms cracked and tender from gripping a billhook for 12 straight hours. Somewhere outside, the conch shell is about to sound. And when it does, your day begins whether you're ready or not. The hut you're lying in is barely a shelter. It's wattle and daub, meaning sticks woven together and packed with mud, topped with a thatch of dried cane leaves. The walls don't reach the roof in places, and the gaps let in mosquitoes, rain, and whatever crawled up from the ground during the night. There's no door, just a piece of old cloth hanging in the frame. The floor is dirt. The entire structure could probably fit inside a modern walk-in closet, and you're sharing it with at least one other person, maybe two. There's no bed, no pillow, no mattress. The concept of comfort here isn't about softness. It's about whether the rain stayed out and the rat stayed quiet. The smell hits you before anything else. It's a particular Caribbean plantation smell that lives in every account from the era. Cane sap fermenting in the nearby trash house, molasses going sour in the drainage vats, the sharp tang of bagasse, the leftover cane fibre, piled into mountains and slowly rotting in the humidity. Underneath it all, smoke from the boiling house chimneys that never fully clears, just hangs in the tropical air like a second sky. And mixed in with everything, the unmistakable scent of unwashed human exhaustion. Because when you work 18 hours a day during crop time, and your only water source is a shared barrel that might also serve the livestock, personal hygiene becomes a luxury nobody's offering. The conch shell sounds. There it is, that low, mournful blast that carries across the estate like something between a foghorn and a funeral announcement. In a world without clocks, without alarms, without any of the gentle negotiations of modern morning routines, the conch shell is absolute. It means get up. It means now. It means the overseer is already awake, already watching, already making mental notes about who emerges from their hut last. And on a sugar estate in 1754, being last is not a social embarrassment. It's a physical risk. You pull yourself upright, every joint protesting, and you step outside into the pre-dawn dark. The village is a cluster of maybe 30 to 40 huts arranged in rows along a dirt path. They call it the Negro Yard, and it sits downhill from the great house, which glows faintly in the distance like a lantern someone forgot to extinguish. Between you and that house lies the entire economic engine of the British Empire's most profitable colony. Cane fields stretching in every direction, the mill with its enormous stone rollers, the boiling house with its 5 copper kettles, the curing house where sugar hardens into cones, and the still house where the leftovers become rum. All of it maintained, operated and fueled by human beings who were brought here against their will from the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. Here's the thing about a sugar plantation that separates it from almost every other form of forced labor in the Americas. It wasn't just a farm. It was a factory. Cotton plantations grew a crop and shipped it somewhere else for processing. Tobacco plantations did the same. But sugar demanded that everything happen on site and happen fast, because once you cut a stalk of sugarcane, the juice inside starts to spoil within hours. You don't have the luxury of waiting. You cut it, you haul it, you crush it, you boil it, you cure it, and you barrel it, all in one continuous, exhausting, dangerous process. The plantation was field and factory combined, and the people working it were expected to do both, from dawn in the fields to midnight in the boiling house, and sometimes straight through to dawn again. If a modern labour board saw the shift schedules on a Jamaican sugar estate, they'd shut the operation down before lunch. In 1754, it was just Tuesday. Let's talk about what you're about to eat, because the answer is not much, and what there is won't exactly inspire confidence. The plantation owner, or more accurately, the overseer running things on his behalf, while the actual owner sits in a London coffee house, sipping the very sugar you produced, provides weekly rations. On a Jamaican estate in the 1750s, that typically means a few pounds of salt herring or mackerel, some cornmeal, maybe a handful of plantains or yams. That's it. That's your entire nutritional intake for a week of the hardest physical labor the 18th century has to offer. The saltfish is often rancid, shipped from New England in barrels that have been sitting in tropical heat for weeks. The cornmeal is coarse and sometimes gritty with sand. There's no fresh meat unless you manage to catch something yourself, which requires time you don't have and energy you can't spare. The caloric math is devastating. A person performing heavy manual labor in tropical heat needs roughly 4,000 to 5,000 calories a day just to maintain body weight and function. The rations provided delivered perhaps half that on a good week. The deficit was constant and compounding. It meant that your body was literally consuming itself, burning through muscle and fat reserves that were never adequately replenished. It meant chronic malnutrition, weakened immunity, and a bone-deep fatigue that no amount of sleep could fix. It meant that every cut healed slowly, every infection spread faster, and every disease hit harder than it would have in a body that was properly fed. But here's where human ingenuity enters the story in ways the planters never fully anticipated or controlled. You have a provision ground. It's a small plot of land, usually on the worst soil the estate has to offer, rocky, steep, up the mountainside, far from the cane fields. The planter gave you this land not out of generosity, but out of economics. Feeding enslaved people properly costs money, and Caribbean planters discovered early that it was cheaper to give people a scrap of marginal land and a few hours on Sundays to feed themselves than to import adequate rations from the American colonies. So on your one day of relative rest, you climb the hillside and tend your garden. You grow yams, sweet potatoes, cassava, pigeon peas, okra, callaloo greens. Maybe you keep a few chickens. If you're resourceful and lucky, you might even have a small pig. These provision grounds became something extraordinary. They were the one space on the plantation where the overseer's eye didn't follow you constantly, where you could talk freely, share news from other estates, pass along information about the outside world, where West African agricultural knowledge carried across the ocean in the minds of people who were supposed to have been stripped of everything, found soil and flourished. Okra cultivation techniques from the Gold Coast, yam varieties from the Niger Delta, methods of intercropping and companion planting that European agronomists wouldn't recognize as sophisticated for another 2 centuries. The provision ground was survival, resistance, and cultural preservation all growing in the same patch of rocky dirt. And if you're thinking that a few rows of yams on a hillside doesn't sound like much of a rebellion, think again. Every calorie grown on that hillside was a calorie the planter didn't control. Every seed saved was knowledge transmitted. Every Sunday spent tending those plants was a day spent practicing autonomy in a world designed to deny it absolutely. There's something else about those provision grounds that tells you a lot about the people who worked them. They weren't just subsistence gardens. They were the foundation of an entire parallel economy. By the early 1700s, enslaved people on islands like Nevis and Jamaica had come to dominate the local food markets. Every Sunday morning in Charlestown, Nevis, they'd bring their surplus produce, their chickens, their eggs, their handcrafted pottery, and sell or trade them. The market ran from sunrise to 9 in the morning, and it was, in many ways, the most economically free space on the island. People with no legal rights to property, no recognized personhood under the law, building an internal market economy out of provision grounds and sheer determination. In Kingston and Spanish Town, Jamaica, the markets were larger and ran longer, and the enslaved people who traded there set prices, built regular customer relationships, and accumulated small sums of money. The money they earned, small as it was, bought extras: a piece of cloth to replace the rough Osnaburg that the planter provided twice a year, a cooking pot, a tool, a length of ribbon, small things that might seem insignificant from the outside but represented something enormous from the inside. The ability to choose, to exercise preference, to acquire something for yourself in a world that told you daily that you were someone else's acquisition. And sometimes the money bought the unthinkable. There are records of enslaved people saving for years, coin by painstaking coin. to purchase their own freedom, buying back the body that was supposed to belong to someone else. That takes a kind of patience and determination that the planters never understood and never could, because understanding it would have meant acknowledging that the people they owned were people, and the entire system depended on not making that acknowledgement. But let's talk about what happens when the provision ground fails, because it did fail, and when it did, the consequences were devastating. Caribbean weather is unpredictable. Hurricanes tear through the islands with a regularity that every planter knew and feared. The great hurricanes of the 1780s flattened provision grounds across Jamaica, destroying months of carefully tended crops in a single night. When the gardens were gone, people starved. Not figuratively, literally. Plantation records from drought years and hurricane seasons document deaths from malnutrition, with the same detached bookkeeping that recorded sugar yields and rum production. The planters' response to famine among the enslaved was not to increase rations, but to calculate the cost of replacement. Hunger was a management problem, not a moral one. And the fact that people managed to feed themselves most of the time on the worst land the estate had to offer, working 1 day a week while exhausted from 6 days of sugar production, was treated not as a testament to their skill, but as evidence that the system worked fine as designed. Sunday is over. It's Monday now, and you're standing in the pre-dawn dark with your meager rations in your belly, and the driver is calling your gang to assembly. Let's talk about the gang system, because this is how sugar plantations organize their workforce, and it tells you everything about what mattered to the people running the operation. There are 3 gangs, and your place in them determines your entire existence. The first gang is the main labor force. These are the strongest, most able-bodied adults, men and women both, typically between the ages of about 16 and 40, and they do the hardest work. During planting season, they dig cane holes by hand, thousands of them, each about 5 inches deep, 18 inches apart, stretching across acres and acres of cleared field. Between 5,000 and 8,000 cane cuttings had to be planted to produce a single acre of sugar. Each cutting was placed by hand, covered by hand, tamped by hand. Your back doesn't straighten for hours. During crop time, from roughly January to June, the first gang cuts and hauls cane, works the mill, works the boiling house, and carries barrels of finished sugar to the loading docks. The first gang is the backbone of the plantation's profit, and they are worked accordingly. Long hours, relentless pace, no mercy for illness, fatigue, or the simple human need to occasionally stop moving. The second gang is slightly less punishing, but only slightly. It's made up of younger workers not yet strong enough for the first gang, older workers whose bodies are breaking down from years of first gang labor, and sometimes nursing mothers who've been pulled back to work within weeks or even days of giving birth. They bundle cut cane into manageable loads, haul them onto wagons, do maintenance work around the estate, clear brush, and carry supplies between the different work zones. The second gang is where people go on their way up to the first gang and on their way down from it, and the traffic in both directions tells you that the first gang is where bodies go to be used up. The third gang is children and elderly workers. Some of the children are 5 or 6 years old. Their primary job is weeding, endless, back-breaking weeding. Because in the Caribbean's tropical climate, weeds grow with such ferocity that they can choke a young cane plant to death in a matter of days if left unchecked. The third gang also hunts rats. Thousands upon thousands of rats infest the cane fields, gnawing through young stalks and nesting in the thick growth. Some overseers offered small bounties per rat killed. turning pest control into a child's first encounter with the concept of piecework compensation. Imagine being 6 years old and your job is killing rats in a sugar field under the tropical sun. That's not a Victorian novel. That's a Caribbean Tuesday. You're in the first gang. And today is a field day during crop time, which means cutting cane from first light until the sun drops below the horizon, and then possibly a shift in the boiling house after that. Let's be very clear about what cutting sugarcane actually involves, because the word cutting does no justice to the reality. Sugarcane in 18th century Jamaica grows between 8 and 12 feet tall. A typical plantation was around 750 acres. The stalks are thick, tough, fibrous, and packed so densely together that standing at the edge of a ripe field is like facing a solid wall of green. To harvest it, you use a billhook, a heavy curved blade about 18 inches long. You grip it with both hands, bend at the waist until your face is at knee height, and hack through the base of the stalk about 6 inches from the ground. The stalk falls. You straighten, strip the leaves with a few fast swipes of the blade, chop off the green leafy top, and toss the cleaned cane into a pile for the second gang to bundle. Then you bend again. Next stalk, and the next, and the next, for 12 hours without meaningful rest. The leaves on sugarcane are not soft. They have edges like fine blades, thin and rigid enough to slice skin on contact. After a few hours in the fields, your forearms, neck, and face are covered in fine cuts, every one of them burning with the salt of your sweat and the acid of the cane juice. The sun is relentless. This is latitude 17 degrees north, full tropical, and there's no shade in a cane field. The heat doesn't just surround you, it presses on you, a physical weight on your head and shoulders, cooking the air in your lungs. You're sweating so heavily that your grip on the billhook handle becomes unreliable, and an unreliable grip on an 18-inch blade moving at full swing is how people lose fingers. It happened often enough that plantation inventories sometimes listed people with missing digits the way a mechanic might note a dent on a car. Behind the gang walks the driver with his cowhide whip. His job is to maintain the pace that gets the cane to the mill before the juice spoils. The cane must be cut, hauled, crushed, and boiled within hours of harvest, or the sugar content drops and the planter's profit drops with it. So the gang cannot slow down, not for heat, not for thirst, not for exhaustion, not for the woman in the next row who just folded at the waist and couldn't straighten up again. The driver is usually an enslaved man himself, selected for his physical size and his ability to push others, a position that traps him between the overseer's quotas and the humanity of the people he's driving. If the gang falls behind, the driver answers for it with his own back. If he pushes too hard and workers start collapsing in numbers that threaten the next day's output, he answers for that too. The system corrupts everything it touches. Here's the thing about Caribbean sugar plantations that doesn't get said loudly enough. The majority of field workers were women. Not some, not many. The majority. Historical records from Jamaica and Barbados consistently show that women comprise the bulk of the first and second gangs. The hardest physical labor on the deadliest. Plantations in the hemisphere fell disproportionately on black women's bodies. They cut cane while pregnant. They returned to the fields within weeks of giving birth. They worked 18-hour shifts in the boiling house, while their nursing infants were watched by other children in the third gang. The gendering of sugar labor was one of the system's most devastating features, and it played out directly in the demographic data. Natural decrease, the historian's term for a population that is dying faster than it can reproduce, worsened throughout the 18th century on sugar estates. Between 1751 and 1775, the death rate among Jamaica's enslaved population outpaced the birth rate by roughly 5% annually. On the Windward Islands, that figure hit an astonishing 11%. Women's bodies bore the double burden of field labor and reproduction, and the plantation gave them no quarter on either front. The result was that the enslaved population in the Caribbean could never sustain itself naturally. The system didn't just use people, it used them up, and the planter class treated this not as a crisis of conscience, but as a supply chain problem solved by purchasing more human beings from Africa. In 1700 alone, about 25,000 Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic. 2/3 of them were bound for sugar colonies. Over the course of the 18th century, more than 1.2 million enslaved people were brought to Jamaica alone. By the time of the 1788 census, the island held only about 226,000 enslaved people, despite those staggering importations, plus all the children born to enslaved mothers across nearly a century. Do the math. Hundreds of thousands of people simply disappeared into the process of sugar production. They arrived on ships. They were sold. They worked. They died. And the ships came back with more. But you're still standing in the cane field, and the sun hasn't reached its highest point. Let's talk about water, or the absence of it. On many estates, water was carried to the field gangs in barrels, hauled by the third gang. Children and elderly workers lugging heavy wooden casks on their shoulders through the rows. The water wasn't always clean. It came from whatever source the estate had available, sometimes a river or spring, sometimes a cistern that collected rainwater along with whatever else the rain washed in. You might get a few swallows between rows, warm, slightly off, tasting of wood and iron, and the faint chemical funk of whatever had leached into the barrel. Dehydration in the Caribbean tropics during heavy labor is not a minor inconvenience. It's a medical emergency waiting to happen. Kidney stress compounds over months. Heat exhaustion can kill. Muscle cramps can seize your entire body mid-stroke and drop you into the cane stubble. And dropping in the field was dangerous because of the blade in your hand and the expectations of the driver behind you. After 12 hours of cutting, the tropical dust descends fast. You might think the day is done. If you're lucky, during the dead season, it is. You'll stagger back to the village, eat whatever cold food you managed to prepare before dawn, and collapse on the dirt floor for a few hours of unconsciousness before it starts again. But during crop time, that 6-month window when the cane is ripe and the mill must run without pause, you might be pulled for the night shift in the boiling house. And the boiling house is where sugar production stops being merely excruciating and becomes actively dangerous. Let's walk into the boiling house together, because you need to feel this space to understand what sugar production actually demanded from the human body. The building itself is maybe 60 feet long and 30 feet wide, stone walls rising to about 15 feet, with the roof open at the ridge to let some of the heat and smoke escape. It doesn't escape fast enough. The moment you step through the wide doorway, the temperature jumps by at least 20 degrees. The air is wet with steam, thick with the smoke from the bagasse fires, and saturated with a sweetness so dense and so relentless that it feels less like a smell and more like a physical substance filling your nostrils and coating your throat. After an hour in the boiling house, everything tastes like sugar. Your sweat tastes like sugar. The steam you breathe tastes like sugar. The sensation would be pleasant for about 30 seconds. After that, it becomes nauseating. After 4 hours, it becomes something you carry in your lungs for days. The 5 coppers of the Jamaica train are arranged in a row along one wall, each one set into a stone furnace with a fire pit below. The largest copper, called the grand copper or the clarifier, holds several hundred gallons of raw cane juice. The smallest, at the far end, is where the concentrated syrup reaches its final state before striking. Between them, the juice is progressively heated, skimmed and reduced, moving from copper to copper as water evaporates and the sugar content concentrates. At each stage, workers with long-handled copper ladles skim impurities from the surface, a job that requires you to lean over a vat of boiling liquid and work with steady precision while your face and arms absorb a continuous blast of heat. The temperature near the coppers is extraordinary. Records and accounts from the period describe the heat in the boiling house during full operation as nearly unbearable. Workers couldn't stay near the fires for more than 4 hours at a stretch. Their hands and forearms swelled from the heat. Their skin blistered, and the burns, when they came, were different from any other kind of burn. Boiling sugar syrup has a higher boiling point than water, over 230 degrees at the striking stage, and its viscosity means it doesn't run off skin the way water does. It grips, it adheres, it continues transferring heat long after contact, burrowing through the outer layers of skin, while the victim frantically tries to scrape it off. Peeling boiling sugar off human flesh tears the skin away with it. Workers in the boiling house carried burn scars the way soldiers carry shrapnel, permanently, and with no possibility of proper medical treatment. The furnaces beneath the coppers are fed by the bagasse, the fibrous remains of the cane stalks after the juice has been extracted by the mill. Bagasse burns hot but fast, which means the fires need constant feeding. Workers assigned to furnace duty spend their shifts shoveling dried cane fiber into the fire pits, maintaining the specific temperature that each copper requires. It's back-breaking, lung-searing work performed in a space where the ambient temperature is already over 100 degrees and the air is thick enough to chew. The furnace workers' faces are lit orange by the flames, their bodies silhouetted against the glow, moving in a rhythm dictated by the appetite of 5 separate fires that never sleep. And through all of this, at the center of the operation, stands the sugar cooker. He moves between the coppers with an authority that no one on the estate, not the overseer, not the bookkeeper, not even the planter himself, can replicate. He tests the syrup constantly. He dips his ladle and watches the way the liquid threads between his thumb and forefinger, testing viscosity despite the scalding temperature. He studies the color, which shifts from pale amber in the clarifier to a deep golden brown in the final copper. He listens to the bubbles because the sound changes as the water content drops and the sugar concentration rises, a shift from a rapid rolling boil to a thick, heavy gurgling that signals the approach of the striking point. When the moment comes, and it comes fast, he calls the strike, and every worker in the building responds. Ladles plunge into the last copper. The syrup is poured rapidly into wooden, cooling frames lined with banana leaves. Speed matters because overcooked syrup won't crystallize properly, and undercooked syrup produces molasses instead of the brown sugar that commands the highest price. The difference between profit and loss for an entire season can come down to 30 seconds of judgment. After the strike, the cooling frames are carried to the curing house, a separate building where the raw sugar is packed into conical clay molds about 3 feet tall, each one with a small hole at the pointed bottom. The sugar sits in these molds for weeks, sometimes months, while molasses slowly drains out through the hole and is collected in pots below. This drainage process, called purging, is what separates the crystallized sugar from the liquid residuals. The longer the sugar purges, the lighter and more refined it becomes, and lighter sugar fetches a higher price in London and Amsterdam. Workers in the curing house turn and maintain thousands of these sugar cones. A theirs quieter job than the boiling house, but still demanding, still performed by enslaved hands in a building that smells permanently of caramelized sweetness and molasses. The drained molasses flows to the distillery, where it begins its transformation into rum. Fermentation tanks, large wooden vats, hold the molasses mixed with water and sometimes a small amount of skimmings from the boiling house. Natural yeasts do the work, converting sugar into alcohol over the course of several days. The resulting liquid, called wash or dunder, is then run through a copper still heated over an open fire. The alcohol vaporizes, travels through a coiled copper tube called a worm that passes through a barrel of cold water, and condenses back into liquid, this time with a significantly higher alcohol content. The first run produces low wine. A second distillation produces the raw rum that will be shipped across the Atlantic. The distillery is dangerous in its own particular ways. Fermentation produces carbon dioxide, and in an enclosed or poorly ventilated space, the gas can accumulate to levels that cause dizziness, confusion, and loss of consciousness. Workers who climbed into fermentation vats for cleaning occasionally collapsed and died from asphyxiation before anyone realized what had happened. The still itself, a copper apparatus sitting over an open flame while processing highly flammable alcohol vapor, represented an explosion risk that was managed primarily through the experience and vigilance of the distiller, who, like the sugar cooker, was an enslaved worker with specialized knowledge that the planter depended on absolutely and compensated almost not at all. The rum produced in Caribbean distilleries was shipped primarily to New England, where it was redistilled into a stronger, clearer spirit, and then loaded onto ships bound for West Africa. In Africa, the rum was traded for enslaved people, who were loaded onto those same ships and transported across the Atlantic to the Caribbean, where they were sold to sugar planters. The sugar they produced was processed into molasses, which was shipped to New England to make more rum, which went to Africa to buy more people, who came to the Caribbean to make more sugar. This is the triangle trade. It looks clean on a map. 3 neat arrows connecting 3 continents. In practice, it was a closed loop of human suffering that generated wealth for everyone except the people doing the actual work. And sugar was the engine that drove the entire cycle. Let's talk about the planter class for a moment, because understanding who they were and how they thought helps explain why the system was so resistant to reform. The typical Jamaican sugar planter in the mid-18th century was, more often than not, an absentee. He lived in England, usually in London or Bristol or one of the fashionable spa towns, spending the profits generated by his Caribbean estates on townhouses, country manners, political influence, and social climbing. He might visit his plantation once in a decade, or never. The actual management fell to an attorney, a local agent who oversaw multiple estates for a fee, and an on-site overseer who handled daily operations. Overseers were, as a class, among the most dangerous people in the system. They were typically young, white, lower-class men from Britain or Ireland who came to the Caribbean because they had no prospects at home. They were paid based on the plantation's output, which gave them a direct financial incentive to maximize production regardless of the human cost. They lived on the estate, had nearly unlimited authority over the enslaved workforce, and were supervised only loosely by the attorney, who had multiple properties to manage and couldn't be everywhere at once. The result was a management structure that placed enormous coercive power in the hands of men with minimal oversight, strong financial incentives to be brutal, and no social connection to the people they controlled. Some overseers were merely indifferent. Some were actively sadistic. Very few, by the nature of the system, had any reason to exercise restraint. The planters' wealth, generated at this distance and through this chain of delegation, was extraordinary. Jamaica's sugar planters were among the wealthiest individuals in the British Empire. Their income dwarfed that of landed gentry in England. They built mansions in London, endowed university chairs, purchased seats in Parliament, and wielded political influence that shaped British policy for decades. When abolitionists began pushing for the end of the slave trade in the late 18th century, the sugar lobby in Parliament was one of the most formidable obstacles they faced. The planters understood perfectly well that their wealth depended on a continuous supply of African labor, and they fought furiously to protect that supply. They funded pamphlets arguing that enslaved Africans were content and well treated. They commissioned artwork showing happy, well-fed workers on picturesque estates. They paid doctors to testify that the conditions on sugar plantations were perfectly healthy. The gap between this propaganda and the actual experience of the people living and dying on those estates was so vast it would be comic if it weren't funded by human blood. And yet the system contained its own vulnerabilities, and the people most aware of those vulnerabilities were the ones with the most to gain from exploiting them. Let's return to the village at night and talk about the ways that resistance organized itself into something larger than individual acts of defiance. The provision grounds and the Sunday markets weren't just economic spaces. They were communications networks. On any given Sunday, enslaved people from multiple estates would converge on a market town, and along with yams and chickens, they traded information. Which overseer was particularly cruel, and which was negligent enough to create opportunities, whether militia patrols ran and when, which ships had recently arrived from Africa, and what news they might carry, which estates had experienced deaths, escapes, or changes in management. This flow of information connected enslaved communities across an entire island in ways that the planter class dimly suspected but could never fully control. Obeah practitioners served as nodes in these networks. Their role as healers and spiritual leaders gave them a standing that transcended individual estates. An Obeah man or woman who traveled between plantations under the guise of selling remedies or attending to the sick carried information and coordinated planning in ways that were invisible to the white power structure. When Tacky's rebellion erupted in Jamaica in 1760, the coordination between multiple estates shocked the British authorities, who couldn't understand how enslaved people who were supposedly isolated and ignorant had managed to organize a synchronized uprising across miles of territory. The answer was in the markets and the provision grounds and the nighttime gatherings that the planters had always considered too trivial to monitor closely. The rebellion itself was devastating. Led by Tacky, an enslaved man believed to have been a chief in West Africa before his capture, it began on the sugar loaf plantation in the parish of St. Mary. Within days, more than 1,000 enslaved people had joined, seizing weapons, burning estates, and killing overseers. The British response required the deployment of regular army troops, the Maroon militias under treaty obligation, and months of military campaigning to suppress. The aftermath was predictably savage. Public executions designed to terrorize the surviving enslaved population into submission. But the rebellion had proved something that could not be unproved. The system was fragile. The people it depended on were not helpless. And the peace that the planters relied on was not consent, but containment, and containment could fail. Let's talk about what you're wearing, because clothing on a sugar plantation tells its own story of deprivation and inevitably of human creativity in the face of that deprivation. Twice a year, if the planter was following standard practice, you received a clothing allotment. For men, this typically meant a single suit of Osnaburg, a rough, coarse linen fabric imported from Germany that felt about as comfortable against skin as a burlap sack, a pair of loose trousers, a shirt, maybe a hat of woven straw. For women, a shift dress of the same Osnaburg and a head wrap. That was it. 2 outfits a year to cover every occasion, from cutting cane in the blistering heat to sleeping on packed earth to attending the Sunday market. The fabric was so rough that it abraded the skin, particularly at the shoulders and waist, where sweat and friction combined to create raw patches that never fully healed, and it wore out fast, within weeks of receiving a new allotment. The fabric was already thinning, developing holes, coming apart at the seams. By the time the next allotment arrived 6 months later, people were wearing rags held together by ingenuity and desperation. Shoes were not provided. This was not an oversight. It was policy. Barefoot workers were slower to run, easier to track, and cheaper to maintain. The practical consequence was that your feet absorbed every hazard the plantation offered. Cane stubble after harvest, sharp as broken glass, hot ash from burned fields, the stones and roots of the provision ground hillside, parasites in contaminated soil, hookworm chief among them, entering through the soles of your feet with every step and establishing colonies in your intestines that drained your blood and your energy for months or years. The absence of shoes was a small thing perhaps, measured against the totality of plantation violence. But it was a small thing you felt with every step of every day, a constant physical reminder that your comfort was not a consideration in any calculation that mattered. But here's where the human refusal to accept dehumanization shows up again, even in something as basic as clothing. Enslaved people used the Sunday market and the provision ground economy to acquire fabric, dyes, and accessories that transformed the planter's utilitarian allotment into something personal. Women dyed their head wraps with indigo and other plant-based pigments, creating vibrant colors that stood out against the drab Osnaburg. They styled them in elaborate wraps that echoed West African traditions, each fold and tuck carrying meaning that the overseer couldn't read. Men fashioned belts and accessories from leather scraps and plant fiber. People adorned themselves for Sunday market with whatever they had, turning a weekly gathering into a display of personal expression that the system hadn't authorized and couldn't prevent. The planter gave you rags. You made them into something that was yours. Let's talk about the middle passage, because you can't understand life on a sugar plantation without understanding what happened before people arrived. The journey from West Africa to the Caribbean was itself a kind of machinery, as calculated and as lethal as the sugar mill. And the people who survived it arrived already carrying wounds that would never fully heal. You were taken. That's how it starts for the vast majority of the people working on this estate. Not born into slavery, taken, maybe captured in a raid, dragged from a village that was attacked at dawn by slavers, African and European alike, who operated along the coast and up the rivers of what is now Ghana, Nigeria, Senegal, the Congo, Angola. Maybe sold by a rival group after a conflict, a practice that European slave traders exploited and encouraged relentlessly, flooding coastal communities with weapons and manufactured goods that made the incentive to capture and sell neighboring people almost irresistible. Maybe convicted of a crime, real or fabricated, by a local authority, who found it profitable to sentence people to sale rather than other punishments. However it happened, you went from being a person with a family, a village, a language, a profession, a spiritual life, a name, to being an item in a ledger. The coast was the last place you saw your homeland. The slave forts, those massive stone structures perched on the cliffs of Cape Coast or on the island of Goree, were holding pens where captured people waited days or weeks or months in underground dungeons for the ships to arrive. The conditions in those dungeons are almost beyond description. Hundreds of people packed into stone chambers with no ventilation, no sanitation, barely any food or water. The floor became a swamp of human waste. Disease spread with terrifying speed. People died waiting to be loaded onto ships, and their bodies sometimes lay among the living for hours before being removed. The psychological horror of confinement, of not knowing what was happening or where you were being taken, of hearing the ocean through the walls and knowing it meant something terrible, is a dimension of the experience that no historical account can fully capture. And then the ship, the Middle Passage, 6 to 12 weeks on a vessel specifically designed to maximize the number of human bodies it could carry across the Atlantic. You were packed into the hold, often shackled to the person next to you, in a space so tight you couldn't sit up fully. The ceiling was sometimes only 18 inches above the platform you lay on. The hold was dark, hot, and unventilated. Seasickness was universal and unrelenting. The smell was beyond anything you've experienced. Vomit, feces, urine, blood, and the gradually sweetening odor of bodies that had stopped breathing and hadn't yet been found. Between 10 and 20% of the people on any given ship died during the crossing. Some from disease, some from dysentery, some from infections that spread through the holds like fire, some from suicide, people who chose the ocean over whatever waited on the other side, who threw themselves over the rail when briefly brought on deck for exercise, or who starved themselves until the crew forced a metal device called a speculum oris between their teeth and poured gruel down their throats. The crew of slave ships were themselves often brutal, desperate men, working one of the most dangerous occupations in the maritime world, with mortality rates nearly as high as those of the captives they transported. The entire enterprise was a machine for converting human beings into profit, and it damaged everyone it touched, though not equally, never equally. You survived. You arrived in Kingston Harbour, blinking in the tropical sunlight after weeks in the dark, your legs barely able to support your weight, your body ravaged by whatever diseases had swept through the hold. Before you were brought ashore, the crew cleaned you up. They rubbed your skin with oil or grease to make it shine. They shaved you. They plugged visible wounds with tar and oakum. They were preparing you for sale, and presentation mattered the way it matters when selling any product. You were marched to the auction block or the scramble, a particularly nightmarish form of sale where buyers rushed into a pen full of newly arrived captives and grabbed whoever they could, and you were sold to the highest bidder, inspected, handled, your teeth examined, your muscles squeezed, your body evaluated for its capacity to produce sugar. And then you belonged to someone, and you were taken to the plantation, where the conch shell would wake you every morning for the rest of your life. The memory of the crossing didn't fade. It lived in the body and in the mind, a foundational trauma that colored every subsequent experience. People who had endured the Middle Passage carried a particular kind of knowledge, the knowledge of how bad things could get, and that knowledge shaped the way they moved through plantation life. It made some people more cautious, more attuned to danger, quicker to read the intentions of the people who controlled them. It made others more reckless, because they'd already survived the worst thing they could imagine and felt, not without reason, that nothing the plantation could throw at them compared to what the ocean had already done. It bound people together across language barriers and ethnic differences, because whatever their origins, they had all come through the same door. Now let's talk about the children born on the plantation, because their experience was different from those who survived the Middle Passage, and understanding that difference matters. A child born into slavery on a Jamaican estate in the 1750s enters a world where enslavement is the only reality they've ever known. They have no memory of Africa, no experience of freedom, no frame of reference for what life could be outside the cane, fields. Their parents do, or their grandparents do, and the stories they tell, the songs they sing, the foods they prepare, and the spiritual practices they maintain are all acts of transmission, attempts to give their children a connection to a world they'll never see. But the children also develop something that the African-born population doesn't always have: an intimate knowledge of the local landscape. They know which paths through the estate are watched and which aren't. They know the overseer's habits, his routines, his blind spots. They know the terrain around the provision grounds and the mountain trails that lead to the maroon settlements. They know the local plants, the ones that heal and the ones that harm, with a specificity that comes from a lifetime of observation. And they carry the Creole language that has evolved on the plantation, a blend of English and various African languages that allows communication across ethnic lines and serves as a linguistic space the overseers can't fully penetrate. The Creole language was itself an act of creation, a new tongue forged from the fragments of shattered linguistic communities, and it carried in its grammar and vocabulary the traces of every African language that contributed to it. Children on the plantation grew up fast. By 5 or 6, they were in the third gang. By 12 or 13, they were moving into the second gang. By 16, the strongest among them were in the first gang, cutting cane alongside adults, their bodies not yet fully grown, but already being treated as fully expendable. There was no adolescence as we understand it, no period of exploration and self-discovery buffered by parental protection and institutional support. There was childhood in the third gang and adulthood in the cane fields, and the transition between them was measured not by age but by physical capacity. And yet, children played. This is one of those details that resist the narrative of total dehumanization, because it's true and it matters. In the margins of the workday, in the Sunday hours, in the brief intervals between labor and sleep, children invented games, told each other stories, chased each other around the huts, fashioned toys from scraps of cane and clay and whatever else was available. They laughed. They teased each other. They did the things that children everywhere do, because the drive to play is as fundamental as the drive to eat, and not even a sugar plantation could entirely suppress it. The sight of children playing in the shadow of the mill, within earshot of the rollers that might one day take their arms, is one of the most painful and most human images this history produces. Let's talk about the economics that connected this plantation to the wider world, because the sugar your labor produces doesn't stay on this island. It enters a global network that reaches from Kingston to London to Amsterdam to Boston, and back to the coast of West Africa. Understanding that network helps explain why the system was so durable and so resistant to change. The sugar you produce is packed into hogsheads, large barrels that hold about 1,000 pounds each, and loaded onto ships in Kingston Harbour. Those ships carry the sugar to England, where it's refined further in sugar houses along the Thames, turned from the brownish, molasses-tinged raw product into the white, refined sugar that graces the tables of the wealthy and, increasingly, the working class. Sugar consumption in England exploded during the 18th century, from a luxury available only to the rich to an everyday commodity. By the 1750s, the average English person was consuming about 4 pounds of sugar per year, a figure that would more than triple by the end of the century. Tea with sugar became a national habit. Sugar in porridge, in pies, in sauces, in medicines. The sweetness that defined English taste was produced entirely by enslaved African labor in the Caribbean. The economics of sugar made certain English cities extraordinarily wealthy. Liverpool, Bristol, and London all grew fat on the sugar trade and the slave trade that supported it. Liverpool's docks handled more slave ships than any other port in Europe. Bristol's merchants financed plantations across the Caribbean. London's bankers provided the credit that allowed planters to buy enslaved people on installment. The wealth generated by sugar-built Georgian townhouses funded philanthropic societies, endowed schools, and supported the cultural flowering of 18th century Britain. The connection between the sugar in the bowl and the blood in the cane field was direct, unambiguous, and almost universally ignored by the people who benefited from it. Insurance companies like Lloyd's of London underwrote slave ships and enslaved people as property. If a ship sank, if a cargo of human beings drowned, the insurer paid out. If an enslaved worker died on the plantation, the planter could file a claim. The financial instruments that emerged from the sugar trade, bills of exchange, commodity futures, insurance products, mortgage-backed securities, became the building blocks of modern capitalism. You cannot separate the history of Western finance from the history of sugar slavery. They grew from the same soil. Let's talk about the skilled workers on the plantation, because they complicate the picture in important ways, and their stories deserve telling. Not everyone on the estate worked in the cane fields or the boiling house. Sugar production required an extraordinary range of skills, and the people who possessed those skills occupied a complicated position in the plantation hierarchy, simultaneously more valued and more trapped than the average field worker. The blacksmith kept the plantation's metal tools in working order. Billhooks, hoe blades, axle pins, mill components, barrel hoops, nails, chains. His forge burned hot from dawn to dark during crop time, and his skill was essential. A dull billhook slowed the cutting gang. A broken mill component could shut down processing for days. The blacksmith was usually an enslaved man who had learned his trade either from an African metalworking tradition or through apprenticeship on the plantation. His knowledge gave him leverage, but leverage within slavery is a strange and limited thing. He might eat slightly better. He might have a marginally better hut. He was less likely to be whipped for minor offenses, because the overseer couldn't afford to injure his hands. But he was still property, still subject to sale, still one bad season away from the auction block. The cooper made the barrels that held the sugar, the molasses, and the rum. Cooperage is a precise craft. Each barrel built from carefully shaped staves bound by iron hoops, watertight and strong enough to survive an Atlantic crossing in the hold of a ship. A leaking barrel meant spoiled product and lost revenue. The cooper's skill directly affected the planter's bottom line, and the best coopers knew it. Like the sugar cooker and the blacksmith, the cooper occupied a position where indispensability provided a fragile buffer against the worst excesses of the system, but only a buffer, never safety, never freedom. The carpenter built and maintained the plantation structures, from the great house to the slave huts to the mill frame. He worked with local hardwoods, cedar and mahogany and lignum vitae, shaping them with tools that he often had to maintain himself, because the plantation's supply chain was irregular and replacements were slow to arrive from England. The carpenter's knowledge of joinery and structural engineering was sophisticated, passed down through training relationships that sometimes spanned decades and crossed plantation boundaries when skilled workers were hired out to neighboring estates. Domestic workers occupied yet another position. The cook, the laundry women, the nursemaids, the house servants who maintained the great house and attended to the planter's family or the overseer's needs. Their proximity to the white power structure was a double-edged reality. On one hand, they had access to better food, better clothing, and shelter from the worst physical labor. On the other, they were under constant surveillance, subject to the personal whims and tempers of the people they served, and vulnerable to forms of abuse that field workers, by virtue of distance, were partially shielded from. Enslaved women in domestic service were particularly vulnerable to sexual violence from the planter, the overseer, or their guests. A dimension of plantation slavery that pervades the historical record while being consistently underemphasized in popular accounts. The hierarchy among the enslaved, from field hand to skilled worker to domestic, was a tool of the planter's control. By creating gradations of privilege within the enslaved community, the system generated internal divisions that complicated solidarity. A cooper, who ate slightly better than a cane cutter, had something to lose by joining a work stoppage. A domestic worker who slept in the great house might hesitate to share information about the overseer's plans if it risked her relatively protected position. These divisions were deliberate, engineered by planters who understood that a unified enslaved workforce was their greatest threat. But the divisions were never total. The provision grounds and the Sunday markets brought people together across occupational lines. The shared experience of being property, of living under the whip, of knowing that any privilege could be revoked at any moment, created bonds that cut across the hierarchy. And when rebellions came, they drew participants from every level of the plantation structure. Let's pause and think about what all of this meant for the wider Atlantic world, because the sugar plantation didn't exist in isolation. It was a node in a global system, and the system reshaped everything it touched. The sugar produced on this estate and thousands like it across the Caribbean transformed European diets, European economies, and European societies in ways that are still visible today. Before Caribbean sugar flooded the market, sweetness was a luxury. Honey was the primary sweetener in European cooking, and refined sugar was so expensive that it was sold by the ounce in apothecary shops. By the mid-18th century, sugar had become an everyday commodity. Working-class families in England put it in their tea, which itself was a colonial product imported from China. They spread it on bread. They used it to preserve fruit. They consumed it in quantities that would have astonished their grandparents. The democratization of sugar, its transformation from a luxury of the rich to a staple of the poor, was made possible entirely by the plantation system and the enslaved labor that powered it. This transformation had profound consequences. The combination of sugar and tea became the fuel of the Industrial Revolution. Factory workers in Manchester and Birmingham drank sweet tea for quick energy, a cheap caloric boost that allowed them to work longer hours for lower wages. Sugar was, in a very literal sense, the energy source that powered British industrialization. The enslaved people cutting cane in Jamaica were feeding the factory workers in Leeds, who were producing the textiles shipped to Africa, which were traded for the enslaved people sent to Jamaica. The connections were circular, self-reinforcing, and almost entirely invisible to the people at every point in the chain. The political consequences were equally enormous. Sugar planters wielded disproportionate political power in the British Parliament. The West India Committee, the sugar lobby, was one of the most powerful interest groups in 18th century British politics. Planters and their allies held dozens of parliamentary seats. They shaped trade policy, military strategy, and colonial administration to protect their interests. When France and England went to war, as they did repeatedly during the century, the Caribbean was often the decisive theatre. The sugar islands were so valuable that the British government sometimes prioritized their defense over the defense of the North American colonies, a strategic choice that contributed to the tensions that would eventually produce the American Revolution. Let's talk about what happened to women on the sugar plantation with the specificity this subject demands, because the gendered dimensions of Caribbean slavery shaped everything from demographics to resistance to the cultural continuity that kept communities alive across generations. The fact that women formed the majority of the field gangs was not accidental. It was a calculated economic decision. Planters assigned the most physically demanding agricultural work to women because they reserved the specialized positions: blacksmith, carpenter, cooper, distiller, sugar, cooker, overwhelmingly for men. The result was a brutal inversion. The work that killed fastest fell disproportionately on women's bodies, while the work that carried a sliver of protection through indispensability went mostly to men. Women cut the cane, women hauled the bundles, women fed the furnaces, women skimmed the boiling coppers, and they did all of this while bearing the additional biological burden of pregnancy, childbirth, and nursing in conditions that made every stage of reproduction dangerous. Pregnancy on a sugar plantation offered no reprieve from labor. Enslaved women were expected to work in the fields until they physically could not, and to return after giving birth within days, or at most a few weeks. There was no prenatal care in any meaningful sense. The physical demands of field labor during pregnancy, the bending, the lifting, the heat, the dehydration, the inadequate nutrition, contributed to staggeringly high rates of miscarriage, stillbirth, and infant mortality. Babies who survived birth faced their own gauntlet. Nursing mothers in the first gang were sometimes allowed brief breaks to feed their infants, but the time was never enough, and the conditions were never adequate. Infant mortality rates on Caribbean sugar plantations were catastrophic, far exceeding those on the North American mainland. Tetanus alone, contracted through the practice of cutting the umbilical cord with unsterile instruments, killed significant numbers of newborns within the first 2 weeks of life. And yet women were the primary carriers of cultural knowledge on the plantation. They cooked the food that maintained culinary traditions from West Africa. They taught children the songs, the stories, the herbal remedies, the spiritual practices. They maintained the domestic space of the hut and the provision ground, the two spaces where enslaved people had the most autonomy. The callaloo pot simmering on Auntie Bess's fire wasn't just dinner. It was an act of cultural warfare, a refusal to let the plantation's logic of efficiency and extraction define the totality of existence. The women who braided their daughters' hair in patterns that echoed styles from the Gold Coast were performing an act of transmission as deliberate and as necessary as any lesson in agriculture or resistance strategy. They were saying, with their hands and their patience, you come from somewhere. You belong to something larger than this cane field. Women also played crucial roles in resistance networks. Their movement between estates, whether through hiring out arrangements, relationships with people on neighboring plantations, or attendance at Sunday markets made them carriers of information. Enslaved women who served in the Great House had access to conversations, documents, and plans that field workers didn't. Some used that access to gather intelligence that fed into broader resistance efforts. Others used their knowledge of plants and healing to serve the community in ways that directly undermined the plantation's control. An herbalist who could induce illness could also keep a would-be runaway healthy enough to make the attempt. A midwife who understood fertility could make choices about reproduction that the planter had no way to detect or control. These were quiet, intimate forms of resistance that rarely made the historical record, but they shaped the daily functioning of plantation communities in ways that mattered enormously. Let's also be clear about sexual violence, because it was endemic to the system and cannot be separated from the economics of sugar. Enslaved women had no legal protection against rape. Overseers, planters, visitors, and sometimes drivers assaulted women with impunity, and the children born of these assaults were themselves enslaved, adding to the planters' property. The mulatto population on Caribbean sugar estates, the visible evidence of this systematic violence, grew throughout the century. Some mixed-race children were given marginally better positions in the household hierarchy. A few were eventually freed. Most were not. They labored alongside everyone else, their lighter skin a daily reminder of a violence that the system not only permitted, but incentivized, since every child born to an enslaved mother was another unit of labor acquired at no cost to the planter. Now let's circle back to the physical landscape one more time, because there's an aspect of it we haven't fully explored. The cane fields themselves. You spend more time in them than anywhere else on the estate, and they have a character that shapes your experience in ways that go beyond the labor itself. A ripe cane field is a world of its own. The stalks grow so tall and so thick that once you're a few rows in, you can't see out. The green walls close around you. The sky narrows to a strip of blue directly overhead. Sound changes inside the cane. The rustling of the leaves creates a constant low hiss that muffles other noises, making it hard to hear the driver's commands or the warning shout of another worker. The air is still and humid, trapped between the rows, and it smells of growing vegetation and the faint sweetness of the sap inside the stalks. Insects are everywhere. Ants climb the stalks in columns. Spiders build webs between the leaves that you walk through face first a dozen times a day. Wasps nest in the thick growth and attack when disturbed. Rats scurry along the ground between your bare feet. Snakes, usually harmless but occasionally not, move through the undergrowth with a sound like dry leaves sliding over each other. The cane field, during harvest, is a different kind of environment. As the gang cuts its way through, the cleared area behind them opens up to the sky, and the sun pours in with full force. The cut stubble is sharp and uneven, rough on bare feet. The piles of topped cane and discarded leaves create a carpet of organic debris that ferments quickly in the heat, adding a sour undertone to the air. Fires are sometimes set to the cane before cutting, a practice that burns off the dry leaves and drives out the rats, but creates its own hazards, walls of flame and smoke that the cutting gang must work toward rather than away from. Cutting burnt cane means working in a landscape of charred stalks and hot ash, your skin blackened with soot, the air thick with particulate matter that lodges in your lungs and stays there. At the edges of the cane fields, where the cultivated land meets the uncultivated hillside, there's a border zone that holds its own significance. This is where the provision grounds begin, where the neat rows of sugar give way to the rougher, steeper, rockier terrain, that the planter didn't want for cane. It's also the beginning of the route to the mountains and to the maroon communities that live beyond the plantation's reach. Every enslaved person on the estate knows the direction, knows roughly how far it is, knows the stories of people who made the journey and either succeeded or were caught. The borderline between the cane field and the mountain is the borderline between slavery and possible freedom, and it runs through the landscape like a visible promise. The trade winds blow across the island constantly, a feature of Caribbean geography that the plantations exploited for their windmills, but that also carried scents, sounds, and information. On certain nights, when the wind came from the right direction, you could smell the sea from the estate, a sharp salt tang that cut through the sweetness of the cane and the smoke of the boiling house. The sea was both barrier and highway. It was what separated you from Africa and what connected the plantation to the world that consumed its products. Ships arrived and departed from Kingston Harbour, visible from the higher ground on some estates, their sails catching the light as they moved through the channel. Some of those ships carried sugar out, some carried people in. The sight of a ship on the horizon meant different things to different people. To the planter, it meant revenue. To the newly arrived, it meant the end of one nightmare and the beginning of another. To the person planning an escape, it might mean opportunity, because a port is a place where people move, and identities can be obscured, and a small, fast boat can disappear into the archipelago. Let's talk about what happened to the body over time, because the physical toll of sugar production wasn't just about exhaustion or injuries. It was a systematic destruction that accumulated day by day, season by season, until the human frame simply couldn't carry the burden anymore. You've been on this plantation for 3 years now. Your spine has developed a curvature from thousands of hours bent over in the cane rows, a permanent reshape of the vertebrae that no amount of stretching can undo. Your knees are damaged, the cartilage ground thin from the endless squatting, climbing, and hauling under heavy loads. Your fingers are permanently swollen, the joints thick with scar tissue and chronic inflammation that makes it harder and harder to grip the billhook with the precision the work demands. Your skin tells the story of your labor more clearly than any plantation record. Scars from the whip cross your upper back in raised welts that have hardened into permanent ridges. Fine white lines from cane leaf cuts pattern your forearms like a map drawn in flesh. Puckered burn marks dot your hands and wrists from the boiling house, each one a memory of a moment when exhaustion slowed your reflexes near the coppers. Your feet, bare for 3 years on stone, mud, cane stubble, and the slick floor of the mill, have developed calluses so thick they've cracked open and been colonized by infections that send red lines up your ankles. Your teeth are loosening. 3 years of nutritional deficiency have leached calcium from your bones and your jaw. Scurvy, caused by a diet almost entirely lacking in vitamin C, softens the gums until they bleed at the slightest touch. Your vision blurs occasionally, another gift of malnutrition and the constant glare of tropical sun, reflecting off cut cane. You carry intestinal parasites, multiple species, from the water and from the soil that entered through the soles of your bare feet. Hookworm alone drains enough blood to maintain a persistent anemia that leaves you dizzy when you stand up too fast and short of breath during the hardest labor. You have recurring fevers that might be malaria, or might be typhoid, or might be something no 18th century healer, European or African, has a name for. There's no diagnosis, no treatment plan, no recovery time allocated in the work schedule. You're sick and you work. You're in pain and you work. Your body is failing in a dozen small ways simultaneously, and you work. And yet you get up every morning when the conch sounds. You sharpen your billhook. You walk to the assembly point. You work. Not because you've made peace with your condition. Not because the system has broken your spirit, though it tries every single day in ways both spectacular and mundane. You endure because you understand something that the planters, for all their ledger books and economic calculations, never grasped. Survival is not surrender. Staying alive inside a machine designed to consume you is the foundation that every other form of resistance rests upon. You can't run if you're dead. You can't plan if you've been worked past the point of thought. You can't pass along the songs and stories and agricultural knowledge and healing wisdom and the names of the places you came from if you don't live long enough to speak them to the children who are growing up in the third gang, pulling weeds and killing rats, learning through your survival that endurance is itself a weapon. Let's slow down and walk through the plantation at night, when the work has finally released you and the village breathes differently. The sun goes down fast in the tropics, barely any twilight, just a rapid dimming from full daylight to deep dark in the span of maybe 30 minutes. The air cools slightly, but not much, dropping from brutal to merely oppressive, and the trade winds pick up, moving through the cane fields with a rushing sound that could almost pass for a river if you closed your eyes. The insects start their evening chorus, a wall of sound so constant and pervasive that you stop hearing it consciously after a few minutes, the way you stop hearing the ticking of a clock. In the village, cooking fires dot the darkness like earthbound constellations. The smell shifts from industrial sweetness to something more human. Callaloo simmering in a clay pot over coals. Cornmeal dumplings steaming in banana leaves. The smoky char of salt fish being grilled on a flat stone. These aren't fancy meals. They're assembled from whatever the provision ground produced and whatever the weekly ration included, and whatever could be foraged, caught, or traded. But they're prepared with care, with attention, with the kind of intentionality that turns mere eating into something that matters. The way the callaloo is seasoned with Scotch bonnet pepper and thyme. The way the yams are roasted in the ashes until the skin chars and the inside turns soft and sweet. These aren't random cooking choices. They're culinary traditions that cross the Atlantic in the memories of West African women and adapted to Caribbean ingredients, creating a cuisine that would eventually influence food cultures across the hemisphere. An older woman everyone calls Auntie Bess tends her fire with the practiced economy of someone who's been doing it for 40 years. She was born on this estate, one of the minority who were, since most of the workforce was born in Africa, and brought here through the Middle Passage. Bess knows things that no one else on the plantation does. She knows which plants in the hillside behind the provision grounds can reduce a fever, which ones can ease the pain of childbirth, which ones can settle a stomach ruined by bad water. She knows stories that connect the people here to places most of them have never seen, but all of them know about, because the stories keep the memory alive. She knows songs in languages that the younger people don't fully understand, but feel in their bones, rhythms and melodies that carry information about where the community came from and what it means to endure. 2 huts down, a man named Will is carving a wooden bowl from a piece of calabash. He works by firelight, using a knife he made himself from a broken piece of iron that he straightened and sharpened over the course of several Sundays. The bowl will hold food, yes, but it's also an object of beauty, carved with a pattern that echoes designs from the Akan region of West Africa, where Will's parents were born. He'll trade it at the Sunday market for a piece of cloth or a handful of nails, and whoever buys it will eat from something that carries in its curves a connection to a place and a tradition that the plantation tried to erase and couldn't. Somewhere at the edge of the village, barely audible over the insect chorus and the crackle of cooking fires, someone is drumming. A quiet, deliberate rhythm on a drum, made from a hollowed log and stretched goatskin, played just loud enough to reach the nearest huts, but not so loud that it carries to the overseer's house. The planters tried to ban drums. They understood correctly that drums were communication devices, that rhythms could carry messages across distances, that a drumbeat in one village could be answered by a drumbeat in the next, linking enslaved communities across miles of cane fields in a network the white power structure couldn't access or decode. So they banned them, and the people played them anyway, quietly, carefully, in the spaces between the overseer's attention spans. The drums never stopped. They just learned to whisper. Children gather around Bess as she begins a story. It's an Anansi tale, brought from the Akan tradition of West Africa, featuring the trickster spider who outsmarts creatures larger and more powerful than himself through cleverness, deception, and an absolute refusal to accept that size equals destiny. Anansi stories were enormously popular on Caribbean plantations, and it doesn't take much imagination to understand why. In a world where the most physically powerful were the least free, stories about a small, clever figure outwitting the strong had a resonance that went far beyond entertainment. Every Anansi tale was a lesson in strategy, in patience, in the power of intelligence over brute force. Every child listening absorbed the implicit message: you are small. The world around you is controlled by those who are physically more powerful. But cleverness is its own kind of strength, and the spider always survives. The night deepens. Fires burn down to coals. People drift toward their huts, where sleep, such as it is, comes in snatches between discomfort and anxiety. The packed earth floor is hard. The thatch roof leaks when it rains, which in the Caribbean is often and sudden. Mosquitoes are a constant torment, their high-pitched whine cutting through whatever peace you've managed to find. You lie in the dark and listen to the plantation sounds, the distant creak of the windmill, which sometimes runs even at night during crop time, the low of cattle in the pen, the occasional bark of a dog, and underneath everything, always, the rush of wind through the cane, that endless whisper that sounds like the island itself breathing. You think about tomorrow because you can't help it. You think about the provision ground, whether the yam vines have set properly, whether the chickens survived the mongoose that's been circling the village. You think about the woman on the neighboring estate who you see at Sunday market and who makes you feel for a few minutes each week like the world is larger than these cane fields. You think about the story best told tonight and wonder if the children understood its real meaning. You think about the place your mother described before she died, a village near a river where the trees were different and the air smelled like rain and red earth, a place you've never seen and may never see, but that lives inside you as surely as your own heartbeat. And then the conch shell sounds again, and the sky isn't even properly light yet, and your body protests every movement as you haul yourself upright, and the day begins again, because that's what the sugar plantation demands. Everything you have every day forever, or until your body gives out and you join the count of the disappeared, the hundreds of thousands who fed the machine and were consumed by it. But the machine didn't get everything. It never got everything. No matter how much it took, it didn't get the Callaloo recipe, or the Anansi stories, or the drum rhythms, or the provision ground knowledge, or the names whispered in the dark. It didn't get the love between the woman at the market and the man who thinks about her every night. It didn't get the songs or the prayers or the fierce, unbreakable insistence on finding moments of beauty inside a system of total ugliness. These things survived because people fought for them, not with weapons, though they used those too when the time came, but with the quiet daily labor of keeping culture alive in conditions designed to kill it. Let's talk about disease, because on a sugar plantation in the 1700s, disease wasn't an occasional visitor. It was a permanent resident. The tropical climate hosted a spectacular and relentless array of pathogens. Malaria, carried by the Anopheles mosquitoes that bred in every puddle and drainage ditch on the estate. Yellow fever, which arrived periodically in devastating epidemics and could kill a quarter of the workforce in weeks. Dysentery, the constant companion of contaminated water and inadequate sanitation. Typhoid, yaws, a bacterial infection that caused painful skin ulcers and, in advanced stages, bone deformity. Hookworm, which entered through the soles of bare feet walking in soil contaminated with human waste. A parasite so perfectly adapted to plantation conditions that it was nearly universal among workers who labored without shoes, which was virtually everyone. Medical care ranged from inadequate to actively harmful. Some larger estates had a hospital, typically a separate hut where sick workers were confined. The treatments available were those of 18th century European medicine, which is to say bloodletting, purgatives, and guesswork. Enslaved healers, drawing on West African and developing Caribbean medical traditions, often provided more effective care using herbal remedies and botanical knowledge. But their work was conducted at the margins, tolerated by overseers only when European methods failed, which was frequently. Newly arrived Africans faced an additional horror called seasoning, a term the planters used with chilling casualness, as if breaking in a new pair of boots rather than systematically destroying human beings. Seasoning referred to the 1 to 3 year adjustment period, during which people who had survived the Middle Passage were introduced to plantation labor and Caribbean diseases. During this period, as many as 1/3 of newly arrived Africans died. Their bodies, already devastated by the Middle Passage, were overwhelmed by unfamiliar diseases, insufficient nutrition, and crushing labor. Think about what that means. A person is kidnapped from their home in West Africa. They endure 6 to 12 weeks in the hold of a slave ship, chained, seasick, terrified, watching others die around them. They survive that. They arrive in Jamaica. They're sold at auction, inspected like livestock. They're taken to a plantation where nothing is familiar, and then 1/3 of them die anyway. The ones who make it through seasoning carry scars deeper than skin. They carry the knowledge of what they've lost and the remarkable determination to keep living despite all of it. Let's talk about punishment, because it held the entire system together. The whip was primary. Overseers and drivers used it for everything from perceived slowness in the fields to running away or stealing food. Whippings were public, performed before the assembled workforce, because deterrence mattered as much as pain. The lash count ranged from a dozen to several hundred. After severe whippings, salt or pepper was sometimes rubbed into the wounds. For running away, punishments escalated. Iron collars with protruding spikes that prevented lying down. Confinement in cramped, dark spaces for days. Branding. The brutality was systematic and deliberate, designed not merely to punish individuals, but to demonstrate to everyone watching the cost of defiance. But here's where the planter's logic collapsed on itself, because it collapsed constantly and in ways they never fully resolved. You cannot simultaneously treat people as thoughtless property and depend on their skilled judgment to run a complex industrial operation. You cannot starve a sugar cooker and expect him to make split-second decisions about striking temperature. You cannot whip a mill feeder and then wonder why her focus wavers at the rollers. The system was always at war with itself, and the people navigating that tension developed strategies of resistance that were as intricate and sophisticated as the system trying to crush them. Work slowdowns were the most common, an entire gang subtly reducing pace just enough to cut production without triggering specific punishment. Tool breaking at suspiciously convenient moments, feigning illness, risky, but sometimes the only way to buy a day of rest. Sabotage, where cane was improperly processed or barrels inadequately sealed, spoiling the product during the Atlantic crossing. Running away was constant. Petit marronage, short absences of days or weeks, was a pressure valve. People would disappear into the mountain interior, rest, visit family on neighboring estates, or simply reclaim the experience of making their own choices for a few days. Grand marronage, permanent escape, was harder but far from impossible. Jamaica's Blue Mountains sheltered communities of Maroons, escaped enslaved people and their descendants who had built free settlements and fought the British to a standstill. The First Maroon War ended in 1739, with a treaty recognizing their autonomy. Their very existence haunted every planter on the island. Proof, living and breathing, that the system was not absolute. And then there was revolt. The Caribbean saw more slave rebellions than any other region in the Americas. Tacky's rebellion in Jamaica in 1760 involved over 1,000 enslaved people and required months of military action to suppress. The Haitian Revolution, beginning in 1791 in Saint-Domingue, the French sugar colony that was the single wealthiest territory in the Caribbean, would destroy the plantation system entirely and create the first Black Republic. That revolution was coordinated through voodoo ceremonies, planned in provision grounds, and executed by people classified as property who understood themselves as warriors. Sugar didn't just produce wealth, it produced the conditions for its own destruction. Let's talk about what the plantation looks like from above, because its layout reveals its priorities with architectural honesty. On the highest, best drained ground sites the Great House. Limestone, whitewashed, wide verandas, mahogany furniture shipped from England. The planter, if he's even on the island, lives here with imported wine, cheese, and silver candlesticks. More often, he's an absentee living in London, and the estate is run by an overseer who manages the day-to-day brutality with the freedom that comes from knowing the owner is 3,000 miles away. Below the Great House, the industrial complex, the mill, the boiling house, the curing house, the distillery. These buildings are substantial, built to protect the expensive machinery that sugar production required. The cattle yard, the carpentry shop, the blacksmith's forge, the cooperage, all essential to keeping the factory running. And then, downhill, downwind, deliberately out of sight of the Great House, the slave village, the rows of huts that house the 200 or so human beings whose labor makes everything else possible. You are essential to the operation but invisible to its aesthetic. Your life supports the sugar supports the wealth, and the wealth supports a world that would rather not think about you. Inside the village, though, something remarkable persists: community. Despite every effort to dehumanize and separate, people build lives. They form families, even though the law doesn't recognize enslaved marriages and children can be sold at any time. They develop bonds with neighbors, sharing food when rations fall short, watching each other's children, caring for the sick. They preserve cultural traditions carried from dozens of different West and Central African nations and adapt them to the Caribbean landscape. Storytelling traditions transform into nighttime gatherings where elders pass down folk tales, cosmological knowledge, and practical survival wisdom. Musical traditions find new expression in drums made from hollowed logs and stretched goatskin, in call and response songs that regulate field work, lift spirits, and carry coded information the overseer can't interpret. A song about a bird flying north might mean someone's planning to run. A verse about a river crossing might carry instructions for reaching the maroon settlements. The music was never just music. It was communication, resistance, memory, and beauty all pulsing in a rhythm that had survived the Middle Passage and would outlast slavery itself. Religious practices blend and evolve. Obeah, rooted in West African spiritual traditions, provides healing knowledge, herbal medicine, and spiritual guidance. The Obeah practitioner commands a respect within the enslaved community that no overseer can grant or take away. Christian elements are adopted and woven into existing practices, not through spiritual conquest, but through creative syncretism. You take what's useful. You stitch it into what you already carry. The food that sustains people deserves more attention because it represents African agricultural genius transplanted and adapted. Women who understood rice cultivation and knew which plants treated fever and which eased childbirth carried that knowledge across the ocean in their minds, since everything else had been taken. On Caribbean provision grounds, that knowledge took root. Okra, brought from West Africa, became a staple of Caribbean cooking. Callaloo, prepared in ways that echoed dishes from the Gold Coast and the Bight of Benin. Yam cultivation techniques passed down through generations. Cassava processing methods. The provision ground diet wasn't just survival food. It was cultural preservation expressed through agriculture and cooking. Enslaved people also made pottery using techniques adapted from African traditions. Women produced cooking vessels, storage jars, and domestic wares from local clays, fired in simple kilns. Archaeologists call this colonaware, and it appears across Caribbean plantation sites. In a system designed to strip every trace of identity and reduce people to interchangeable labor units, human beings persisted in making functional, beautiful things with their hands. They insisted on having a material culture. They refused to be reduced to bodies for the mill. Let's talk about the night, after the work releases you. The village comes alive in a way that belongs to its people, gathering around a fire built from scraps, sharing whatever the provision ground produced. An older woman named Grace, the name the planter gave her, though she carries another name privately, plaits her granddaughter's hair, while her neighbor Esther stirs callaloo over the coals. Two men sit on an upturned crate, mending a fishing net. An elder begins a story, and the children gather close, and for a few minutes, the plantation recedes. The overseer is in his house, the driver is in his hut, and here, in this small circle of firelight and voice, people remember who they were before all this. People who had nations and languages and histories that stretched back centuries before any European ship appeared on any African coast. The music that emerged from these villages would eventually transform the world. Rhythms from the Akan, the Igbo, the Fon, the Congo, and dozens of other peoples mingled in the Caribbean crucible. Work songs, call and response patterns, drumming that the planters tried repeatedly to ban because drums could carry messages across miles and coordinate collective action. The planters were right to fear the music. It was everything they couldn't control. memory and resistance and beauty and defiance and grief and joy all at once. And it would eventually give the world jazz, blues, reggae, calypso, and 100 other forms that trace their lineage to those fire-lit circles. And so, the days pass. Conch shell, field, mill, boiling house, fragments of sleep, conch shell again. January through June is crop time, the most brutal stretch, when workers put in 18 to 20 hours daily. July through December is the dead season, slightly less lethal, devoted to planting, weeding, maintenance and repair. The body adapts in ways no body should have to. Calluses layer over calluses, scars accumulate, the spine curves, the joints thicken. You learn to sleep standing up against a wall of the boiling house. You learn to eat while walking. You learn to measure time not by hours but by the position of the sun and the sound of the conch. Let's talk about something that rarely makes the textbooks: the economics of your body. You, as an enslaved person, on a Jamaican sugar estate in the 1750s, are worth roughly 40 to 60 pounds sterling. That's the market price for a healthy adult field worker. Your body is collateral. Planters took out mortgages using enslaved people as security. Banks in London and Amsterdam issued loans against the value of human property. Insurance companies offered policies on enslaved people, paying out when they died the way they'd pay out on a lost cargo. Because that's what you were, legally, not a person. Cargo, a depreciating asset in a portfolio that also included land, cattle, and copper kettles. These financial instruments didn't stay in the Caribbean. They flowed into the broader Atlantic economy, becoming foundations for modern banking, insurance, and investment. Sugar profits built country estates in England, funded British industrial expansion, and bankrolled the growth of cities like Liverpool and Bristol. The wealth was everywhere, in the sugar bowl on the dining table, the bricks of the townhouse, the endowment of the university. And at the base of it all, invisible and essential, the labor of people like you. People whose names were rarely recorded, whose stories were rarely told, and whose contributions to building the modern world were systematically erased. The night deepens over the plantation. The fires in the boiling house have been banked. The mill is still. The trade winds push through the cane fields with a sound like rushing water, bending the tall stalks in slow waves that look almost peaceful from a distance. In your hut, you lie on the packed earth and listen. Someone coughs next door. A child murmurs in sleep. Somewhere farther off, someone is humming. A melody that doesn't belong to this island. A melody carried across 3,000 miles of ocean in the memory of someone who refused to forget where they came from. Let's pause here, in the quiet space between one day ending and another beginning, and talk about the dead season, those months from July to December, when the mill falls silent and the boiling house fires go cold, and the plantation shifts from its frantic crop time tempo to something slightly less lethal. The dead season isn't rest. Don't mistake it for that. There's planting to do, new cane cuttings placed into the thousands of holes dug by the first gang. There's weeding, always weeding, because the tropical climate doesn't pause its growth cycle just because the harvest is over. There's maintenance on the mill, the boiling house, the curing house, the roads, the fences, the drainage ditches. The dead season is the time when the plantation repairs itself, using the same hands that broke it down during crop time. But the pace is different. The 18 and 20-hour days of crop time drop to something closer to 12 or 14. The boiling house isn't running through the night. The mill isn't demanding continuous feeding. There are more hours of darkness that belong to you, or at least aren't claimed by the industrial process. And in those hours, the life of the village expands. More time for the provision ground. More time for cooking, for conversation, for the nighttime gatherings where stories are told and songs are sung and plans are whispered. The dead season is when relationships deepen, when courtships happen, when the social fabric of the community gets mended along with the machinery. Sundays during the dead season feel almost like freedom, if you squint hard enough and don't look at the great house on the hill. You wake without the conch shell. You eat food you grew yourself, prepared the way you choose, seasoned with the peppers and herbs from your own garden. You walk to the market in town and spend a few hours in a space where your labor belongs to you and your earnings are your own. You see people from other estates and exchange news that the overseer would rather you didn't have. You buy a piece of ribbon for someone you care about, or a clay pipe, or a small mirror, objects so ordinary that in any other context they'd barely register, but here they represent something enormous: choice, agency. The small, stubborn insistence on being a person who wants things and acquires them and gives them to other people out of affection rather than obligation. We covered a lot of ground tonight, and none of it was easy ground to walk. You felt the heat of the cane fields and the roar of the boiling house. You stood at the mill and understood why an axe hung on the wall. You tasted the meager rations and climbed the hillside to the provision ground where West African farming knowledge took root in Caribbean soil. You met the sugar cooker whose expertise was worth more than anyone would ever pay him. You sat with the mathematics of disposability, the staggering arithmetic of a system that consumed human beings faster than they could be born and simply ordered more. But here's what matters most, and what this story is really about. The people who endured this were never just victims of sugar. They were the reason any of it worked at all. Every crystal of sugar that crossed the Atlantic existed because enslaved Africans brought extraordinary skill, endurance, agricultural knowledge, and sheer force of will to a system that gave them nothing in return except suffering. The sugar cooker's expertise, the field worker's stamina, the provision ground farmer's botanical genius, the healer's knowledge of plants and the body, the mother's fierce, unbreakable insistence on keeping her children alive and teaching them who they were. These were not accidents of survival. They were deliberate acts of will performed by full human beings inside a machine that classified them as less than human. And they resisted. Every single day, in ways large and small. They slowed the pace when the driver's back was turned. They broke tools that could be mended later. They tended gardens that fed their bodies and their spirits on the same patch of dirt. They sang songs that carried messages no overseer could decode. They ran when running was possible and endured when it wasn't. They preserved languages, stories, recipes, spiritual practices, healing traditions, musical forms, and the sheer stubborn refusal to be reduced to nothing. And eventually, through uprising and advocacy, and the relentless moral pressure of people who knew they deserved to be free, the system cracked. Not quickly, not easily, not without unimaginable cost, but it cracked. And the people who cracked it had been doing the impossible, surviving a sugar plantation, since before the cracking even began. So as you lie here tonight in your own bed, in your own room, with clean water and a full stomach, and the extraordinary, ordinary miracle of being able to decide for yourself when to sleep and when to wake, think about the people who made tonight's history possible. Not the planters, not the merchants or the bankers or the politicians who debated abolition while the sugar bowl sat on the table in front of them. The people who cut the cane and fed the mill and stirred the copper kettles and still found the strength to sing when the day was done. They are the ones who made it through. Their descendants walked out of slavery and built lives and communities and movements that reshaped the world. Whisper a quiet thank you to them tonight, not because they suffered for you, though the sweetness in your kitchen has a direct line back to their labor, but because they lived despite everything that tried to stop them, because they proved that no system, no matter how brutal, no matter how profitable, no matter how deeply entrenched in the economies of empires, is stronger than the human insistence on being human. Now close your eyes. Let the fan hum softly. Let the weight of the day lift from your shoulders the way the trade winds lift through the cane at night. You're safe. You're warm. You're free to rest, truly rest, in a way that millions of people who came before you could only dream about. Carry their stories with you, not as a burden, but as a reminder that the sweetest things in this world have always had a cost, and that the people who bore that cost, who carried it on their backs and in their bones, and in the quiet songs they hummed in the dark, were remarkable beyond anything the history books have ever given them credit for. Sleep well tonight. And their courage echoes still in every fight for justice, in every refusal to accept that some lives matter less than others, in every act of building something beautiful out of almost nothing. They endured so that what they endured would not be forgotten. Rest now, and remember,